Hello, and welcome.
Hey Terry,
Hi there. How you doing?
I'm doing well, sir. How are you?
Yeah, good. Yeah, I don't know how many we're expecting today. Maybe a quiet one.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I'm new to the SIG, but have been working a lot in MLOps and ML infra. So I wanted to tag along to a couple of these SIG meetings and just kind of see what the community is like, and start getting involved.
Yeah, awesome. Good to have you. Have you had a chance to read through the roadmap document?
I have, yeah. Here, let me pull it up. Yeah, I took a good, pretty decent read through. I thought it was interesting. Um, Definitely an interesting perspective. Like defining that, you know, trying to give a definition for ML ops as applying DevOps principles to kind of this ML field. It's pretty interesting. And that so far, the reason why I was kind of compelled to join and check you guys out is because it resonated. A lot of things, like with how I've implemented and kind of in my past 6 months, just kind of like going through kind of the field and kind of bumping into different tools and how do different companies do it, how do my buddies and other companies do it. I've landed on something pretty similar to what the roadmap is saying, which is, I don't know, I thought it was highly interesting. So that's why I was motivated to kind of see what the current conversation is like and so the community is like.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of people who are going through the same experience at the moment, which is that they're trying to add machine learning to various products, and they're running up against all of the same challenges.
Yeah.
And what we're starting to see now is a more visible picture of the problems that people have been encountering for a while, and a lot of quite visible failures because people haven't been able to get over that hump and actually get something reliable into production.
Yeah, I would agree. Have you heard of, so Netflix has a nice open source framework that hits on a lot of things called Metaflow. Have you heard of that or looked into that at all?
Yeah, I've had a play with that in the past, and I like some of the stuff around, DAGs and things like that, and trying to put some structure around stuff. But at the end of the day, most of the platforms that are out there they're written from a data-centric perspective, which is not surprising because that's where they've come from. But it also means that they tend to think of things as being like databases. So you have a place in the world where you put your data and a place in the world where you put your models, and those are operational stores of data that change on an ad hoc basis over the course of a day, which is where we were 20 years ago with all of our software systems. But the difference being that as the rest of the industry moved on to solving larger problems at scale and tackling some of the issues that come with that scale, there was more of a push towards managing your software assets in a much more controlled fashion. And so that side of the industry has moved more towards DevOps and managed automated release processes and versioning and having very tight control over the explicit definition of what assets you have in production in what state at any moment in time.
Yep.
And so it's just the ML stuff is on the same learning curve, but at an earlier part of that curve. But it's dealing with a harder problem to solve, because instead of versioning, a few gigabytes of software source, you're trying to version potentially petabytes of training data. And also you're dealing with things that are by their very nature much more mission critical in terms of what they do as products and the data they rely on to do their thing. So it puts machine learning right in the thick end of being high risk, and at the sharp end of having to solve all of the hardest problems to mitigate that risk. So it's kind of unfair, really, for the industry to leave the ML guys to try and solve all the problems from first principles. We really need to pull all of the information we've learned over the past 30 or 40 years and use that to just make things easier and more robust and reliable, and generally improve things.
Yeah, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts. So kind of carrying through the analogy where DevOps made a developer's the skill sets are separate, like especially the deeper you go into DevOps and deeper you go into software, it can be like separate little chunks of knowledge bases that you kind of have to learn, which is why it can be specialized skill sets. But to me, in my experience, it feels like, because I was trained in software development and engineering, it was quite easy for me to pick up DevOps, get caught up to speed, get onboarded, and kind of make changes. And kind of be an influence in, how should I maybe structure this, and kind of be a voice in the room. Now, when I think about my data scientists and modelers that I work with, they have a completely different training, completely different background, where for a lot of them, coming from like R, MATLAB, and then pick up Python, and then now, but it's not really Python, it's really Pandas and TensorFlow. It's not really engineering, it's more, that's why we call it like modeling. I mean, there are some engineering principles. That's why I kind of liked, or I favored Metaflow, or we're kind of experimenting with it, because it seemed like it would blend for what I would want as an engineer. Like, no, or you guys have a line on the roadmap of you shouldn't be deploying Jupyter notebooks, right? Which I would agree. But for these are like PhD statisticians. They barely know what a deploy is. They don't really care. They also don't really care about, well, they kind of care about versioning because it's practical. To a practical point, they care about versioning, but really kind of like, as you get in the nitty gritty of things, to them, what seems like the nitty gritty, to me, it seems like engineering best practices. I'm wondering where in software, I feel, or as software development, I feel like there's been less of a friction point for me to understand and appreciate DevOps and understand and appreciate the importance of it, and then carry whatever responsibilities I have to do as an engineer to kind of keep the standard high on the DevOps side and help out. It's been a fairly frictionless process for me to do so, but I can't really see that happening with my modelers I work with. These people who spend all their time in stats and modeling and kind of like keeping up to date. And, I mean, they're whizzes at R and MATLAB and these Python libraries, but so kind of that, to me, I don't know. I guess, what do you think about that? Where for me, I feel like I've had to do a lot of extra legwork to kind of keep things like, no, we should version, no, here's how we're going to do things, and this is why it's important. So yeah, it's kind of interesting, or I think I guess that's what I'm kind of specifically curious about right now, where how can we integrate um, like these people that have completely different training, and it seems like it'll be a little difficult for them to kind of like learn engineering, or maybe that's will trend to be the expectation of is having these specialists pick up some sort of engineering principles um, to kind of like help integrate this DevOps mentality into the common work.
Yeah, and I think that's a key piece of the puzzle. I mean, from my experience, I've worked with groups of data scientists and taught them DevOps best practice. And initially there was some resistance because, well, it means doing extra work.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
then people start to understand the implications of not doing it. And once people get their head around the basic concepts, it suddenly makes things easier for them. And a big part of this is that it helps people to feel confident in switching things on, and that getting that balance right of having a degree of confidence in the provability of the work that you've done and the fact that it's safe, versus the overconfidence of just not knowing or caring what happens if you press the go button.
Yeah.
That's a big piece, and we're unfortunately we're about to go into a period of time where we see a whole string of very public mess ups from machine learning that wasn't properly managed and went into production, and as a result lots of people lose lots of money or get injured or killed, or a whole raft of fairly horrific things that are likely to happen when we put these decision-making systems live without properly assessing and testing them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's eventually it'll come back down to, oh, well, it's my job to know this stuff, and if I don't know it, there's a chance I'll go to jail. And we're seeing some pretty tough moves in terms of legislation on machine learning, and certainly in the European Union, the proposed legislation is extraordinarily strict, and the penalties are huge. So if that gets implemented, you're suddenly going to see a major switch in everybody's behavior, because just it will feel very, very unsafe to operate without a huge amount of governance and lots of checks and balances.
So you think that over time, because of the kind of like regulation, government will catch up, people's current unsafe practices will produce very negative outcomes. Because of that, you think over the next 5-10 years, it'll, maybe earlier, but the job description of a data scientist or a modeler will get changed slightly to include a bit more of this type of like DevOps rigor and discipline?
Well, the position that we're taking really with the roadmap is that if you're implementing MLOps correctly, then your MLOps team is not a team of data scientists. It's a mixed discipline team that contains data scientists and software engineers and SREs and security people, and that you're operating collectively to maximize the quality of a product. And the focus here is, if you always think about this from a product perspective rather than from an engineering perspective, is actually a lot easier to see what needs to be done, because what the thing that makes the money is the product. And therefore you have to have enough quality in your product, and you have to maintain that as an asset over the period of time you're going to realize the value out of it. And so you have to invest what's necessary to maximize your return, whilst guaranteeing that you're not exposing yourself to unnecessary commercial risk through a poorly maintained product. That becomes a question of technical debt at that point, really.
Yeah, interesting. At what level of, I'm trying to think. So I'm helping a company out. They have 2 modelers, 5 data engineers, and or maybe 3 data engineers. And they're right now at the point where they're thinking we might need someone to build some sort of ML infra support, so that people actually have some sort of common infrastructure to, standardize some build tools and basically MLOps. At what point do you think, or actually, I guess borrowing from like the DevOps analogy, I'm thinking at what point does it make sense to implement DevOps? It's more like on a gradient. What's the first thing do you think is worth it to kind of implement in kind of a newer, quickly growing team? Or I guess if I'm borrowing from the DevOps analogy, then it's probably something like CI/CD, some sort of continuous deployment and integration. But what do you think about that?
So the way I usually explain it to sort of a commercial audience is to say that if you're a technology company, you're building a machine that represents your product. So you have to build all of the bits of that machine that you can't buy. And when the machine runs, it will do whatever your product intends it to do. But you also have to own another machine, which is the machine that builds your product. And so you have 2 assets that you have to manage all of the time. One is the thing that's your product, and the other is the thing that builds your product. And you have to carefully manage and invest in both of those things and incrementally improve them over time. Otherwise, you don't get to have a product. And a lot of what goes into the machine that builds your product is actually about saving you time and money by reducing risk. And the thing that trips people up is that they tend to think about building products as being a linear journey. So you start at one point, you keep going forwards until you reach the end goal, and then you're finished. But of course, it's never like that. It's always a circular, iterative process where you're going round and round and round, incrementally improving things until you get to a point where you've got product market fit, and then you can scale. But you're still scaling in a circular, lots and lots of circular patterns, adding small features to your overarching product. Now, if you think about it that way, it's easier to understand the benefits of the investment that goes into the machine that builds the product. Because if you're thinking linearly, you tend to do things by hand, brute force, because you think, oh, I'm only going to do this once, so I'll just sweat through it and we'll get there. Because in reality, what happens is that it doesn't work when you get there, and you have to go back to the beginning and do it again slightly differently. And every time you're then pushing through the same amount of manual labor. And each time you do that manual process, it adds more bugs than you take out because you were sloppy about it, because you weren't thinking about it as part of your asset. You were thinking about it as an annoyance that you need to push through to get out of the way. So, you know, in many cases, having a lot of manual processes going on moves you backwards rather than forwards. And the more change you have, the faster you go backwards. So as soon as you start to recognize that you're in an iterative process where you're incrementally doing certain things every day or multiple times a day, you should immediately be investing in automating those processes and putting automated testing on them, because then you don't have to do that work ever again. You just push the button, it does it for you, and it tells you it's good or bad. And then you shave off all of that time multiple times a day, and you're getting an immediate return on investment. So you can focus on what's important rather than on, you know, getting the thing to actually build and getting it to actually deploy. I don't know if that answers your question, but you know, those are the sort of basic principles. And in fact, in one of the other SIG groups, we're actually writing up a best practice guide for DevOps and MLOps, which discusses a lot of this stuff and how to think about the problem in a way that naturally takes you to good solutions rather than risky ones.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think this doesn't answer my question. So more, you know, iterative cycle of looking at the friction points. How can I make my, you know, people I work with, or how can I empower them to do their jobs, you know, better, faster, easier, focus on, you know, shipping high quality code instead of focusing on, you know, this build failed, let me run 10 different scripts to go find out why, and then run another 10 different scripts to deploy something safely and, you know, monitor it for 2 hours by myself to make sure it's okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And applying that to the ML guys, I think it makes a lot of sense too.
Another way to think about it is, rather than thinking about it from a development perspective, where there's a tendency to declare things done prematurely, if you think about it from a commercial perspective, you know, it's done when it's live in production and the customer's using it and preferably giving you money for the privilege.
Yeah.
And at that point, if it's broken, it's actively costing you money and reputational damage.
Mm-hmm.
So if you work backwards from that point and say, okay, we just deployed an asset,
right,
and it's broken in production, what do we have to do to get out of this situation?
Yeah.
If the answer is not obvious, then you haven't yet got an appropriate MLOps process in place, because really you should be operating in a situation where if you've deployed a product and the product has failed in production, it should be as simple as pressing a button to reverse that deployment and take you back to your previously known good state.
Mm-hmm.
So if you haven't got that, that's actually your first goal is to be able to deploy on that basis, because then you have no fear of deploying because there's an undo button.
Yeah, that was, you know, not to, I promise I don't work for Metaflow, but it was that I was very pleased to see when we implemented Metaflow that they have a built-in, you know, revert to last successful deploy. And that to me, like, you know, we haven't gone through the full iteration cycle yet of, you know, deploying the process and with my ML team and letting them feel what it's like to put something in production, see the data, the resulting data that comes out of it. And then when things inevitably go wrong, to feel the pain of, you know, how do I fix this? So they haven't seen that yet. So they didn't understand my joy, but from my experience from, you know, shipping normal software products, it's a huge, you know, burden or weight off my shoulders. It's just a huge worry, just relieved. Just knowing that there is like built-in, they take an interesting approach for it, but you know, there's a built-in way to revert to, you know, because they keep a record and version of every model you deploy. So then, or rather they help facilitate that. So then just being able to, you know, revert back and keep the Linux on that, it was, you know, I think it's a step in the right direction for sure.
Yeah, and the other thing that tends to be a blind spot for people who are inside ML teams is that what you're building is a product. And if you look at the entirety of that product, the ML bit is usually about 5% of the effort.
Yeah.
Now, it might be the 5% that defines whether or not the product works, but it's only a component of all of the things that have to be built to actually go live with this product. And so if you're thinking about asset management at a product level, you want to be able to deploy everything that represents that product in a consistent and reliable way, because the model itself is a little bit of the back end somewhere that, you know, exposes an API and is being consumed by the rest of the product.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got to maintain the integration between that part of the product and the rest of the product consistently in a production environment. So although the work that goes into building the model looks independent from the rest of the product team, actually they're closely coupled, and you need them to really be deployable in a consistent way. And that's one of the things that worries me a little bit about the current generation of sort of production ML platforms, is that they tend to be model servers. So what happens is you set up the model server at the beginning of the project, and then that's where the rest of the product goes to get access to a model. But the models themselves are getting arbitrarily pushed into that model server on some different cadence to the release cycle for the rest of the product. And there's a lot of quite nasty problems that can creep in if you've got, you know, disconnect between the release cycles of your whole product and one component of the product. And so there's a lot of ways that your asset can suffer from bit rot if those things get out of sync over an extended period of time. Get a lot of bugs that appear only in production because there's insufficient interconnect between your deployment and release processes.
Yeah.
And this is effectively, if you're using a model server, then your machine learning team is building stuff and chucking it over a wall to the rest of your product team.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you're running DevOps across the rest of your product, you aren't where it counts in the machine learning area, because you're trying to treat your models as operational data rather than assets.
Yeah. So if I'm hearing you correctly, it's almost like you should treat your models as almost as deployables, where they should be on a release cycle as well, synced up to kind of the movement and hope, it'd be awesome even if they use the same tool set for the tool chain as kind of like typical software engineering.
So here's the way that I encourage people to think about this problem. And again, it's a problem that you only encounter late in the process when it's too late to do anything about it easily. Anyone can deploy version 1 of anything. But if you're a successful business, you need to be onboarding customers as quickly as possible and delivering new features as quickly as possible. Now, every time you onboard a new customer, you're typically creating a new instance of a software stack for that customer, pinned to a set of version numbers for each of the APIs involved. Now, as soon as you go live with that for that customer, that's a stake in the ground that is now holding you back, because you've got a bunch of people who are paying you to use a particular version of your thing. And the more customers you've got, the more pins you've got that are making it harder for you to change things. So in practice, you always get to a situation where you have to be able to manage multiple versions of assets under your control in production environments in parallel. And that's because you get to a point where you can no longer do a big bang release because your customers won't accept it. Right. So you're always going to have some customers who are early adopters who'll go straight onto a new release, and some that are a bit slower, and then some that will take years to move over. So you should expect at minimum 3 different versions of something running in production. And you should expect that those 3 versions are actually internally incompatible because of the way you're developing stuff. So you can manage that easily with a good DevOps process and controlled asset releases into something like Kubernetes. But if you're using a single point of failure like a database or a model server, you start to hit significant version management problems at that point in your architecture. And these are the sorts of things that actually kill businesses, because these are the things that will stop you from scaling at the pace you need to actually become profitable. And if you haven't planned for them and architected for them up front, it can take you a year to recover from discovering that you needed that. And you don't have that year in your runway.
Yeah. That's highly interesting.
But again, these are all things that you learn by getting your fingers burnt. But for most data scientists, they've yet to successfully release their first product. So they've never had any of those types of experiences. So the need for that sort of forward thinking and planning doesn't yet exist in their model of the universe. Yeah,
that's interesting. I've had the unique experience of being able to work early stage, sort of mid stage, but the second company is a little earlier than mid stage, and then like a later stage company. And I don't know, you got me curious. I don't actually know the specifics of how they handled that in the later stage company. Yeah, I'll look into that. That's interesting.
Yeah, because that is, I mean, it trips up everybody from startups through to really big engineering companies that should know better, and it's one of the disaster situations that can completely kill a product.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've seen very large, multi-billion-dollar products where version 1 of something was released to the market, and they spent a year building version 2, and at the point at which they went to press go on version 2, they realized that they hadn't actually explicitly versioned any of the APIs in the first release. And they had thousands of customers using those APIs, but no way to tell whether a request that was coming in was meant for the first version or the second version of the APIs.
That's, yeah.
And it took a year to recover from that.
Yeah. That's tough. That's a sticky situation to be in. Yeah.
But all of that applies to your models, with the added caveat that typically models are going to be used in scenarios where they'll be more long running than a lot of software. Because a model will be trained to do a role within a business. It'll be tending to replace a person or augment a person as part of a business activity. And if the business still exists and is still trading in the same way, it'll still be doing the same business activities. So you build a machine learning product, it may be considered a 10-year asset or a 15-year asset, which means you're going to have to keep that thing running for your customers for that many years, and they aren't going to want to keep poking around with it and changing things. So you end up with a very long-running version management problem, which is typically worse than the sort of thing we see in classical software.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I'll do some digging. Is there mention of of this topic on the roadmap and best practices?
Yeah, so there's some of this is in the best practices document, and some of it I touch on in some of my talks.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I'll do some more reading. It's definitely interesting. Yeah. So for the SIG and just kind of overall, how might I come in and get more involved? Subscribe to the mailing list, or are there any other communities? Because I think this new and developing field of MLOps is, it's definitely on the forefront. It's definitely very interesting. So I'd definitely like to get involved in any way possible.
So have you joined the CDF Slack group?
So good you brought that up. I tried, and it looked like it was locked to certain domains. Let me see if I can pull that up again.
So there should be a link, I think, in the
GitHub
top of the MLOps SIG repo.
Yep.
That should get you an invite to join that. If it's not working, we might need to get the link refreshed.
Yeah. So it says the email address must match one of the domains listed below, and there's opsmx.io, opsmx.com, Netflix, Red Hat, and intuitive.ai. Those are the whitelisted domains.
Okay, that looks like that's a problem. All right, I will investigate that and find out what's going on. Are you on the mailing list?
Sorry, what was that?
Did you join the mailing list?
Yep, I joined the mailing list for the SIG. Yeah.
Okay, well, if I get a resolution to that, I'll send a mail out to notify everyone.
Cool. Yep, sounds good.
Yeah. So the Slack is the easiest way to sort of ask questions and get involved. And then if you have specifics that you think we should be discussing, then you're welcome to make a PR on the document. The 2021 document is in the repo and it's in draft, so we're accepting changes to that at the moment. So feel free to moot a challenge or a technology requirement, and then we can start discussing it in a review thread, and we'll polish and expand on it and put it in the document.
Yep. Okay. Sounds good. Does the SIG host any talks, like a tech talks or lunch and learns, or any activities outside of the once every 2 weeks recurring calendar, or this meeting?
We occasionally do bits and pieces. I've been doing quite a lot of community outreach this year at various conferences. So you'll be seeing a bunch of conference talks getting published as we go through those conferences. So there's a CDCon talk on MLOps using Jenkins X. And I've just this morning finished a talk for a conference later in the year. Got to do another one tomorrow. So there will be a bunch of these coming out over the course of the year discussing different aspects of MLOps and some of the issues involved.
Okay, cool. Very good. Yeah.
And if you've got a specific need and want someone to come in and give a talk, then feel free to reach out.
Yeah, will do. Yeah, the rest of this year should be highly interesting, I think, and going into next year as well. Yeah.
Okay, well, given it's just us, I guess we can probably wind up at this point.
Yeah, that's a nice natural closing point. Nice to meet you, Terry. Yeah, looking forward to seeing you around, hopefully chatting again. This was interesting.
Yeah, well, feel free to come along to these sessions. We're in the middle of the summer, so it's usually quiet around this period.
Yeah.
But when we get into the sort of thick of finalizing changes for the document, then there's generally more discussion going on, and we get a larger group meeting up face to face.
Okay. I saw that on the calendar invite on the repo, it recurs until August 26th. Is that just the natural ending point for that segment, or
we renew them periodically? I think we put like blocks of 10 on or something like that, if I remember correctly.
Okay. Cool. Sounds good. Then yeah, natural ending point. We'll talk soon, Terry. Thanks for your time.
Good to have you along.